Welcome, everyone. We're here with our Wednesday seminar at SSP. For Rochelle Terman, I'm incredibly excited. This is a scholar whose work I've followed since she started publishing in top outlets with methods and theories that very much speak to my own interests. Rochelle is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago. We have many peer institutions, but we feel that Chicago is a special peer. She specializes in international relations with an emphasis on norms, human rights, and the Muslim world. And her book, Geopolitics of Shaming, When Human Rights Pressure Works and When It Backfires, came out in 2023 with Princeton. I could also review more of your CV, although in conversations with one of your recent collaborators, I learned there's even more papers that I haven't fully appreciated. And so I won't perjure myself further by going through it, but it's a really impressive body of work. As usual, our norm is really for clarifying questions only during the talk. We'll let you go till about 45 or so, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Please join me in welcoming Rochelle.
Hi. Thank you, everybody. Thank you all for having me. This is my first time at MIT, and I'm really pleased to be here. I was just reminiscing with Josh, and my husband went here for graduate school, and he was the first person in his family to go to college, didn't really know anything about academia, went to a small commuter college in Detroit. But he heard that there was this school on the East Coast that was good for engineering. And so he didn't really know much about it, but he threw his hat in the ring and ended up coming here for engineering. So we just had, I was telling Neil, just had twin babies, and I might get some MIT onesies for them on the way home as the budding engineers that they are. But for now, I'm really happy to have the opportunity to present some new work. This is going to be a bit of a strange talk, perhaps because I'm going to present something that's very data-driven, very inductive, almost completely atheoretical, but I do believe will yield some implications that will speak to some really core theoretical debates in our field. And so I am hoping that this will spur a bit of a brainstorming session amongst us and spark some ideas and feedback that I think will really influence the trajectory of the project. And so your feedback is going to be really important to us today. So this project is with some colleagues at the University of Chicago, so sociologists, okay, and that sociological lens will come through. But it is called The Nation in Our Minds, Historical Representation of Countries in Google Books. A bit on the motivation for IR scholars, public perceptions, public understandings are a central concern. The way that a public sees a country and understands it has a tremendous effect on their foreign policy attitudes, their support to cooperate with that country, trade with that country, go to war with that country, the extent to which they see it as a friend or an enemy, as a potential partner or as a military threat, and so on. Traditionally, scholars have relied on surveys to capture public perceptions. More recently, they've turned to mass media as a source of attitude formation or as a window into public discourse. But as data sources, both surveys and existing textual corpora face some serious limitations. So for example, they're limited by time. A survey is one snapshot in time. Sometimes you're lucky enough to get a longitudinal survey, but it covers, at most a few decades. They're limited by scope. A survey instrument asks a narrow, specialized question. Text corpora are often limited to certain domains, certain speakers, certain platforms that limit their generalizability. Surveys could be more representative in that regard, but they're also limited by dimensionality. They'll have you reduce your complex attitudes down into something like a Likert scale or a feeling thermometer. And so it does, all of these methods are incredibly useful. They may not capture the complexity of public attitudes towards foreign affairs. And that's where our contribution comes in. We're going to introduce a new data set of country representations in the Google Books corpus. This is a massive corpus that covers millions upon millions of books, of English language books. And we're going to use it to track how 256 countries and quasi-countries have been represented in both American and British print culture from 1900 to 2019. And we're going to try to do two things. One is to estimate the distribution of attention given to countries by measuring the frequency of country mentions. And we're also going to estimate the distribution of meaning that is attached to those countries using embeddings. We expect that these data will be of broad interest to scholars of world history, culture, and politics. And to demonstrate that, I'll show you a brief exercise in which we use the data to analyze historical change in representations, or what we're calling country images, over time. Okay. A bit about the Google Books Ngram corpus. The Google Books corpus is one of, if not the largest, publicly available corpora in existence. It emerges out of Google's massive effort to digitize books and periodicals so that it can later produce LLMs, but that's a story for another day. Well, one nice thing that came out of that is that we have this massive corpus of books. And the full contents of the books are often under copyright, and so they're not publicly available. But Google releases chunks of text known as n-grams, which are kind of like phrases that appear together in a sentence. So a 1 gram would be just a word, for example, the. A 2 gram or bigram would be the followed by the next word. So for example, the cat. This will continue. A 5 gram would be something like the cat was sleeping on. And the maximum that Google offers is 5 grams. Okay, so the corpus is made up of a count of the number of times that each unique 5 gram appears in all the books in the corpus in a given year. So some 5 grams are probably going to be quite frequent. 4 years is probably a phrase, a 5 gram, that I would venture to guess has appeared quite a number of times in the corpus. Other 5 grams are going to be less common, but that is what the corpus is basically made up of, is we have this collection of 5 grams. There's no way for us to kind of backward engineer with all the 5 grams to make up a book, because we don't know in what order they appear. But we do have these 5 gram kind of snapshots of text. Okay. Like any sample, the Google Books Ngram corpus contains strengths and limitations. Its main advantage, of course, is the unparalleled size and scope, aggregating a huge number of texts from a wide variety of authors, genres, topics. That said, though, it's not perfectly representative of American or British society. It's not a random sample of books. Despite its size. And there is some evidence to believe that the corpus is skewed more towards scientific articles, professional texts, and things like that. It also omits information about the circulation or the popularity of books. So one book might have sold 2 copies. Some book might be like my book that sold, 1,000 copies, maybe, if I'm lucky. Other books have sold millions and millions of copies. And yet all of these books will appear just once in the corpus, okay? So it's essentially like a library in which each text appears only once and are given equal weight in the corpus. Despite those limitations, though, the corpus has been used widely by scholars for quantitative analysis of cultural and linguistic trends, and it's especially useful to capture a macro analysis of historical change in culture and in language. So a common application is to use Google Books as a kind of window into, into historic public opinion. So instead of asking people about their attitudes, you can see what they have written about those topics. And based on that premise, the corpus has been used to examine cultural understandings and biases towards around class, gender, ethnicity, and other social groupings. It's especially useful for that. That being said, when we're going to apply this to IR, and we're the first to our knowledge to systematically apply it to international relations, and it's important to keep in mind that the corpus is not specific to international relations. The vast majority of volumes in Google Books have nothing to do with international relations. And that's going to be important to keep in mind because a term like Chad is probably not going to apply to the country Chad or Jordan. And unlike news, it is not going to necessarily represent contemporary events. In fact, there's no way of knowing in our data whether a mention of France has to do with contemporary France, whether it has to do with historical France. Maybe it was a book published in 2000 that was about the French Revolution, for example. Maybe it has to do with a historical France or a fictional France. Okay, I'm reading a novel right now about France. Okay, maybe it has to do with some kind of speculative fiction about some parallel universe of France. Okay, we just don't know. That said, the fact that our culture is interested in historical France or fictional France or speculative fiction alternative reality France might tell us something about how we understand France and might tell us something meaningful about how our culture is oriented towards France. Okay, so that's the basic premise, that the corpus is suited to capturing deeper cultural narratives rather than current events or reactive commentary. So we use this corpus to provide 3 types of data. The first is a dictionary, a comprehensive dictionary of country names, including information about aliases and alternative names. The second is information that captures the distribution of attention that's measured using frequency of country mentions. And then finally, the distribution of meaning, the associations, the semantic associations that are attached to countries that we use with word embeddings over time. So I'm now just going to walk through each of these data, what they look like, some descriptive findings. So the first is a dictionary of country names for 256 current countries, historical countries like the Soviet Union, proto or quasi countries like Tibet or Palestine from 1900 to 2019. And this includes information on both what we're calling country entities and country names. Country names refers to the text that's used to refer to the entity. And it's important to distinguish between entities and names because the same country can be known through multiple aliases. So for some states, those aliases or names are practically synonymous. Democratic Republic of Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo. The only difference is linguistic and minor, grammatical. Others, Yemen, Arab Republic, and South Yemen, even though they're grammatically different, they're used interchangeably, it appears, over time. Other countries like Netherlands and Holland, I learned through this project, are not synonymous. And people will get mad at you in some contexts if you use one over the other. And if you are doing a Texas data project, especially early in the century, and you use the Netherlands, you're going to run into mistakes. Okay, so we think that this information alone, aliases, historical titles, polysemes, so Turkey, for example. How do we know whether, apparently we have discovered through this project that a capital T Turkey, 90% of the time, if it's not at the beginning of a sentence, even if it is at the beginning of the sentence, 90% of the time it refers to the country. Okay. We wouldn't have known that. So we included Turkey. We did have to remove things like Chad and Jordan because they hardly ever referred to countries. Okay, but we think that even this information, even though it's not like the central finding of the project, is itself a contribution, because if anyone here who has used Texas data has run into these problems, it's kind of a perennial problem or ubiquitous problem. And we think the dictionary alone can be useful to IR scholars, even if you're not necessarily doing something that's quantitative. Okay, if you're looking in the archives, for example, that this might be useful to you. Yeah.
Clarifying question. Does the x-axis here, the time, is that the time of the publication of the book where you see this diagram?
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, thanks for that clarification. So what these dates refer to are the books that are published in that year. Okay, so sometimes you'll have like multiple editions of books. And so if there's an edition published in 2000, another edition published in 2005, then that would be two separate volumes. And there's no actual way to know whether they are the same text, if that makes sense. They're treated as like two totally different volumes. So each year we're counting the 5 grams of newly published books in that year. Okay. All right. Okay. So then we collected data on the absolute and relative frequency of country mentions per year, as well as mentions of those aliases. So for example, we measure how often the country United Kingdom was mentioned in the year 2010 in American books. That's an observation. We also have information on the number of times that the name Great Britain or United Kingdom or just Britain was published in American books in that year. Okay. So what do these quantities represent? Like, how should we understand what this means? Well, we interpret frequencies as an indicator of public attention or more specifically, cultural salience. Okay. Meaning that the extent to which a foreign country occupies space in American or British public discourse. A higher frequency indicates greater salience, indicates greater visibility, whether a country is viewed as an economic partner or as a military threat or some kind of cultural reference point. So our concept of cultural salience is related to things like geopolitical power or newsworthiness, but is not the same as either of those. And I'm going to show you with some findings a little bit more what I mean by that. I don't know why these are in pink, but hopefully, and the next graph is going to be in pink too. But hopefully you can see, I'll walk you through it. So we're going to provide a number of validation exercises to demonstrate that country mentions are a good indicator of cultural salience. So first, we should expect that cultural salience of a country should increase once that country comes into existence, right? That the mentions of country should increase markedly after that country is formally recognized. So, for example, the Czech Republic should increase in frequency after 1994. Ukraine should increase in frequency after 1991. And so on. This line indicates the year in which it entered the correlates of war system. And more generally, we plotted how this works for the median country. So This is 25 years before the start date, 25 years after. And we see that mentions rise markedly in the years surrounding independence or recognition. And interestingly, frequencies actually begin to rise in the several years prior to formal recognition, implying that kind of public discourse anticipates sovereignty to some extent, or stateness, right? So the key point that I want you to take away here is that our measure, it reflects exogenous reality to some extent, but ultimately it is a measure of discourse, okay? So it is not reducible to material events. Earlier, I mentioned that cultural salience was not necessarily the same as geopolitical power. And we can see that pretty clearly by looking at just the most frequent countries, frequently mentioned countries over time. So these are just kind of in 20-year periods. And we can see that many of the most frequently mentioned countries are also the most influential. Powerful states like Germany and China will attract sustained attention. But salience also reflects enduring cultural linkages. Italy and France, for example, remained prominent long after their political dominance waned, by virtue probably of their deep associations in our culture with art, cuisine, and history. Okay. I am preempting myself a little bit by saying that this is going to become potentially useful and when we try to engage with theoretical debates like how are reputations sustained? How are status sustained? It's not these more intersubjective beliefs do not necessarily track material reality, that they can become embedded in our culture. Okay. We can also validate this sense, this kind of intuition by comparing across American and British books. So the last two plots that I showed you combined American and British books. This compares the two, British English on the x-axis, American English on the y-axis. And if this is measuring cultural salience, then we should expect some similarities and some differences. So frequencies are strongly correlated overall, but American books overrepresent countries like Mexico, Canada, USSR, China, Japan, Israel, while British books overemphasize, relatively speaking, India, Australia, South Africa, Ireland. And I think that those disparities make sense given what we know about each country's strategic geography and colonial history, if this is really capturing cultural salience. Okay. The last descriptive plot I'll show you, it relates to something I said earlier, which is that this is not a measure of geopolitical power, and it's also not a measure of newsworthiness per se. It's related to newsworthiness, but it's distinct. And we can see that by comparing our corpus to mentions of countries in the New York Times. So this plot shows the relative rankings. So like what's the most popular country, what's the second most popular country, and so on, for the 50 most frequently mentioned countries during the 1990s. Okay, so this is just a snapshot of the 1990s. And we see again that there's a correlation that countries that are frequently mentioned in Google Books are also frequently mentioned in the New York Times. But the correlation is not perfect, and we shouldn't expect them to be perfect. Because as a news source, the New York Times focuses on countries involved in current events. Google Books, though, includes works of fiction, includes works of history, texts that are not related to the news. So some states are going to have higher relative frequencies in one corpus or another. Netherlands and USSR. So one reminder, we have measures of every country and proto-country for each year, regardless of whether they were actually in existence or not. Okay. So we have a measure of the Soviet Union, even if the Soviet Union did not exist. Okay. And that's why you see Soviet Union and Russia, because we kind of treat them as distinct. And the point is that we are still talking about the Soviet Union, even though the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. So books like Soviet Union, the Netherlands are relatively more discussed in our culture than they are in the news. Countries like Iraq, Turkey represent the inverse trend, at least in the 1990s, that they were more discussed in the news than they were talked about in our culture. Okay. Again, we think that this shows that cultural salience, this actually comports with other findings that looks like in communication studies, that finds that, yes, much of our public agenda is shaped by the news, but that it's also distinct. That the news tend to feature commentary related to current events, whereas our culture, it reflects more enduring social ties. Okay. So I'm now going to talk about the last kind of data that we collected. Remember that the frequency of country mentions looks at the distribution of attention, but we're also interested in actually how those countries are represented and what meanings they were ascribed. So to do this, we estimate yearly word embeddings for both country names and associated traits. Word embeddings are a text as data technique that thinks about or models meaning as a kind of geometry, okay? Meaning that words are represented as vectors in a multidimensional space, and words that are closer together in this space are seen as more similar semantically, and words that are far apart. So we should expect, run and running to be very close to each other in this space. We should expect banana and Soviet to be pretty far apart, okay? Because they are not used together as often. They do not share semantic similarity. That's true. I'm not saying, this is just on average. One of the nice things about this corpus is that it takes a very, very high up view, and all of this is very relative to each other. So there's no way to absolutely interpret these similarities. It's just it's less similar than run and running. Okay, no shade on Soviet bananas. Okay. So this is very helpful because anything that you can do with a vector, you can do with words. So the classic example would be analogies. So for example, we might think that man relates to king as woman is to queen. Okay. We can model that as a spatial relationship, that the relationship between man and king is parallel to the relationship between woman and queen. And that the line segments that are connecting them have something to do with gender on one dimension and royalty in another direction. Okay. We estimate word embeddings per year, which is going to be really helpful in understanding how the meaning of words change over time. So that's what this plot is meant to illustrate. For example, the word gay was closer to words like daft and tasteful in the 1900s. It was closer to words like bright and witty in the 1950s, and now has the association. Its use is primarily concerning a sexual orientation beginning in the 1990s. Okay, so this is going to help us track how countries are associated with various traits and adjectives and dimensions of meaning over time. I'm not going to go deeply into our method, into our pipeline. Of course, I'm happy to answer any questions in the Q&A or after the seminar. I will mention just some special steps that we took. One is compounding country tokens. So now the Soviet Union has one embedding, as opposed to Soviet having embedding and Union has an embedding. We are have a kind of alignment where we can compare these embeddings over time. And we also took custom evaluation that does that kind of analogy testing that I was just describing, but with capitals, just to make sure that our embeddings are legitimate. Okay. So now I want to provide a practical application of what this can actually tell us. And we're going to do so using an analysis of country representations or country images in American print discourse. So I'm just going to focus on the American corpus. So we're interested in three questions here. So the first is, how are countries represented in various periods? How do those images change over time? And to what extent are they stable and why? So practically, we're going to restrict to the 100 most frequent countries in American English discourse. We hand curate a list of traits that we think that are especially pertinent to international politics. And then we're going to compute a measure of distance between every country and every trait. And that will give us an estimation of the strength of the association between a country and a given trait relative to the associations of every other country in that trait. Okay. So first, how are countries represented? This is everything I'm going to show you is illustrative. There is going to be no cross-national comparison. We're just kind of very blatantly hand curating and some examples that we think are helpful. So this is an illustration using 5 countries and their most distinctive traits. Okay, so across the entire time frame of the corpus. So one noticeable kind of interesting aspect of this is that antonyms appear together. So for example, China is associated with both modern and traditional. China is associated with both growth and decline. I think that this indicates that countries are associated not just with traits, but like with frames. It's one thing to say, where does China fall along some kind of ordinal dimension of status? But before we get there, there's a prior step, which is that we are interested in the extent to which China is growing or declining, meaning that we see China and talk about China in the framework of growth and decline and of status. And we don't do that with every other country. We don't have debates, or at least as many debates, about whether Ecuador is rising or falling, about whether Iran is rising or falling. We have other frames that we associate with those countries. Okay, but China appears to figure largely within a growth decline discursive frame, whereas Japan is associated with discursive framing around advancement. Russia and the Soviet Union are associated with frames around grand strategy and so on. Okay. Second, how do these images change over time? So we're going to zoom in to narratives around China. So I'm going to just walk you through this plot. This illustrates the strength of China's associations with various traits on the y-axis here, over time across the x-axis here. And the darker shade of red, the stronger that association is. The associations that are particularly strong are highlighted in a white border. And what this shows is that, I think it's the white border is like the top 5 percentile. Oh, excuse me. What this shows is that China's representation in the early part of the 20th century was fairly non-distinct. Okay, it wasn't particularly rich. It wasn't particularly rising. It wasn't particularly major. Okay, it was neither a threat nor a friend. Okay? But after 1960, 1970, China began to emerge as a major geopolitical power, and it attracted more attention as well as a more distinctive image. in American public consciousness. It became increasingly associated with traits like growth and decline and rising. That's why we see more white borders, more distinctive traits over time. It is forging a more distinctive image in the public conversation. And then finally, we were interested in how stable those representations were over time. So, and again, I know this, I'm just gonna walk you through this plot. What this shows is we calculate every country's year-to-year correlations on all traits, okay, which is what you see in those heat maps. So that on the left is China, and here is Iran. So for example, how does China's representation in 1980 correlate with its representation in 1940, or correlate with its representation in 2000? Okay. Again, the darker colors of red indicate a stronger association. And what this shows, I think Iran is actually a more clear example, is that its representation in Google Books changed drastically during certain cut points. Okay, so around 1935 or so, its associations before 1935 have nothing to do with its representations after 1935. Okay. Well, you might ask yourself what happened around 1935. This is when the first Shah of Iran asked the world not to call it Persia anymore. Okay. And everyone started calling it Iran. And suddenly Iran, the word Iran, took on a very different connotation. It took on a very different meaning. We also see a major cutoff point around 1979. That one is a little bit more obvious. That's when the Islamic Revolution happened. And the presentation of Iran in Google Books were just associated with drastically different traits. With China, the change was more gradual, but you do see that it is relatively unstable in the beginning of the century, and took on a more coherent and stable representation, again, beginning around 1960. So to us, this suggests a hypothesis that has to do with an important puzzle in international relations, which are how reputations are formed, altered, or sustained over time. So some reputations, as we know, can be quite sticky, meaning that external events change, and yet the way that we talk about that country remains remarkably stable in the face of those changes. There have been a number of explanations for that in IR theory, having to do with institutions, having to do with, for example, their perceived strength and so on. But we suggest another mechanism which is rooted in mass media and culture. It could be that the more a country is talked about, the more cemented and sticky its reputation becomes. And you kind of think about any given person. If you don't know them very well, you might not have a strong reputation about that person. But as you interact with that person more and more, and you gain more information, that person's reputation becomes more segmented in your psychology. Okay, and there's probably something similar going on here as well. So we have to think not just about good status or bad status, or status for this trait or status for that trait, but how strong is that reputation? Okay, is it a strong reputation in the sense that it's very clear and obvious, or is it a weaker reputation in the sense that it's less stable? Okay, we think that there are some other interesting hypotheses that come out that could be pursued with this data as well. So, for example, how do new states or aspiring states achieve their stateness? There's sometimes the debate that you will hear about, like, Ukraine's not a real country. Palestine's not a real country. Of course, people mean all sorts of things by that. But one way to think about what constitutes a real country is whether people think and see it as a country. And regardless of whether Palestine, for example, is officially recognized, there could be something important about the way that publics around the world see its sovereignty. And then finally, of course, we're interested in how country images interact with real world events. How does going to war or mass atrocities, for example, affect country images, and for how long? Many people are interested now in how the war in Gaza has changed people's perception of Israel and how long that perception will last after the war. This could give us a window into those types of questions. So thank you for your attention. If you have any other ideas about where we can go, I'm going to be really interested to hear. Thank you.
Great. This is the part where I say again that I am awful with names and I don't know everyone in the room. So this is psychologically terrifying. So I'm going to start with Raymond and work through my phone and the list to try to get everyone else. Keep your hands up.
Yeah, thank you for the really interesting talk. Do you think your measure is a leading or a lagging indicator of like concepts that we're interested in IR, like status or sort of associations or relationships with like, you know, roles like adversary? Like, do you think it's leading or lagging, or does it vary across like different categories?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. On the one hand, I think for the vast majority of things that it's lagging. And in fact, there have been some studies, various quality that attempt to pinpoint how many years it is lagging. So it takes time. It's not like news. It takes time for events in the world to make their way into books. And if anyone here has ever published a book, they will know that by the time that it gets on the shelves, it's already out of date. According to one study that I saw, it was around 7 years. That is like the average for how long it takes for like big world events to make their way into Google Books. That's why something that I didn't show here in this talk, but I'm happy to share, are like some correlation analysis between mentions and various events out there in the real world and associations and out there in the real world. And I put in, does it make any difference whether it's just the measure of frequency or measure of frequency 7 years into the future, which would make it a lagging variable vis-a-vis the outside events. And it doesn't really make a huge difference. And maybe that's just because the associations are so strong. I don't know. But I will say that on average, it's probably lagging. But I do think that there are some elements, like some that I showed you, that where it could be leading, that we start to talk about Palestine as a state before it actually becomes a state. And I think that is one area in which maybe perhaps public discourse will actually, and cultural change will actually lead the change in external reality rather than lag.
Great. Next, I'll go to Christine.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I was wondering if you could talk about if you think the results will be different if we look at, I guess, more serious topics like politics and economics or like current event, or versus some more like innocuous or topics like, I don't know, children's book, fiction, or those kind of works. Do you think the kind of reputation or topics are different, or how does that exist?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one way that we try to get at this is that there is a Google Books corpus that is only focused on fiction. So it tries to scope out all the fiction books. I'm not exactly sure the technical details behind how they figure out whether something's fiction or not. But it is, to be honest, I haven't like really dug into the analyses there, but some very, very preliminary observations was that it didn't actually make a huge difference but That being said, these books, there's the main corpus. I can't scope out fiction. It's not like there's a fiction corpus, but I can't look at like the nonfiction corpus, if that makes sense. The main corpus includes everything. And so it's not like I can scope out just journals or just news or just IR textbooks or something like that. But it was surprising how similar they were. Which makes me think, that fiction is a representation of our culture. Fiction is what do they say, truer than nonfiction or truer than reality in some ways. And I think that perhaps there's something to that.
In the back, and I'm sorry, I'm forgetting your name.
Yeah, no, I'm Mariana Gutierrez, and I'm a researcher here. Thank you so much for this presentation. And what was evidently a huge piece of work and analysis. But at the end of it, I'm left wondering what was sort of counterintuitive about the findings that maybe this research yielded. For me, my impression is that basically this showcase, this methodology is something that could confirm our intuitions about what things are in the real world anyways, right? What have you encountered in this research that was not intuitive, that perhaps posed a puzzle that's worth probing further?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for that. As it's tough with these types of Texas data projects to separate what is confirmation and thus valid, and what is perhaps surprising and that can tell us something that we didn't already know. But I think that there's a lot here. So, for example, the fact, the way that we talk about reputations of countries, I think is very unilinear. And although it appears perhaps makes sense or obvious in retrospect, I don't think we fully appreciate the extent to which we talk about various countries in terms of particular frames. So that we associate China with the debate around status. And that's why it's associated with both growth and decline. That there was already a particular psychological bias or perspective. I don't mean bias in a bad way. I just mean like a kind of a form of understanding that we situate China in conversations around status or decline. And that has become a cultural norm that has perpetuated itself. Whereas we don't necessarily, and we as so another practical example is we associate Iran with debates around security and threat. And in some ways you might say, yeah, duh, because they're a threat. But I don't think it's necessarily obvious. I think that in many ways we see it as a threat because we talk about it as a threat. And we understand events in the world through that lens. Events don't speak for themselves. Events are filtered through our words and our language and our understandings and our intersubjective beliefs. And so whether we see otherwise neutral actions as a threat to the United States or a sign of rising power or as a technological marvel will depend on the discursive frames that we apply to those events. And for that, I think is something, perhaps that's not surprising to you, but I do think that that is underappreciated in our conversations in international politics.
Yeah.
Yeah, hi, I'm a first year PhD student. I'm Andrea, so I'm deep in the journey of trying to understand research design. So how were you able to account for context, or maybe you haven't gotten there yet, context wherein states are referred to by their capital names, wherein maybe it's like foreign policy discussions or crises that may be a little bit more charged? And do you think that reference to a capital name vice the state name would have a meaningful difference in the distinct traits that you associated with them?
Could you say a little bit more about the difference between a capital name versus a state name? Because most state names are capitalized.
Or not capital, like saying London vice the United Kingdom or Washington vice the United
States. Oh, the capital,
yeah.
Not like, okay.
Not capitalized.
Not like case.
Not uppercase.
Not case.
No.
Okay.
The physical.
Thank you. I'm glad I asked, so I don't make assumptions. And another great way of how our preconceived discursive assumptions will color how we understand we'll call it the way that we accept information. Okay, so yeah, that's a great question. Unfortunately, I don't have very much to say about it because we all decided to only limit it to the state name. But you're right that, and the reason for that is mostly practical, because a lot of capitals are very polysemantic, if that's a word. So, for example, Washington is a great example. Washington could refer to, a million different things. And it was also just another practical because capitals change across history. This was actually a big problem when we tried to do that analogy testing to make sure that our embeddings were valid by seeing if we could predict their capitals. But like capitals change a lot across history. And so for those kind of practical reasons, we kind of scope that out. But we do have embeddings for every word with the case removed. So we do have an embedding for Washington. We just didn't center that in our analysis, if that makes sense. And also we didn't look at like other ways that a country is going to be referred, like French, right? The French, okay? Those kind of adjectives that refer to people, right? It was just going to kind of mushroom out of control. Yeah.
You're next. I think your name is Beanish, but I'm not sure.
I'm Venus. I'm a postdoc here. I have a very great presentation. My question relates to how you think about the broader project and any bias that might occur by only basing this on English. And what are we missing when we're not looking at the non-English kind of commentary, especially because you're using terms like, this is reputation, cultural salience, and like image of the world. So in that context, it kind of seems like this is about the broader, like how the world views certain things. So maybe if you can talk about that. And very quickly, two things I thought were really interesting to maybe also in terms of future directions. One is looking at more sentiment analyses that we see a lot coming out of these structural topical models that the research is coming out. If you've thought about that, and then who are the authors, and if there's any way to kind of like measure the demographics of the authors that are writing certain things or on certain topics. Those are things you've talked about. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'll take the latter point first because it's an easy one. Meaning we have no idea who wrote these books. We have no idea what the books are. We just have the 5 gram. So we have no way to match the 5 grams with the text in which they came. And that's a major, major limitation of the corpus. But I love your first question because I actually came to this project being interested in cross-language analyses. I think that we have a huge, huge English bias in especially American international relations. I think that we completely take it for granted and that it messes up all sorts of knowledge that we supposedly have. So to give you one example from another project that I'm working on, where we looked at Google search results. So if you type in human rights, if I type in human rights and if you type in human rights, we'll get different results because it's personalized. And if someone is searching human rights in another language, they'll definitely get different results. And so we found a way to actually collect Google search pages from 150 countries or something like that. And if you are speaking in a non-English, French, Arabic, Spanish language, you get almost nothing, basically nothing from these organizations like the United Nations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. We make this assumption that norms are just going to spread across these actors. These actors produce information that are just going to spread around the world. We completely take for granted the language in which they produce that information, and it has profound effects on the way that information spreads across borders. And this is perhaps one reason, you could speculate about why human rights discourse is not very salient in countries like India, and China, or because there's just nothing produced. The only things that are produced in those languages are by governments. I mean, it's been completely co-opted by government actors. So I want to make clear, when I say cultural salience, I mean American cultural salience. And I do, which we should always keep in mind is not representative of the rest of the world. And in one direction that would be that I was planning to go with this project is that we can do the same thing for the French corpus, the Spanish corpus, the Russian corpus, the Italian corpus, the Hebrew corpus, and to make those kinds of comparisons.
Diana's next. I'll say also that we're actually doing okay on time, and in a limited dispensation, which we may have to shut down, I'll even allow multiple questions. While the cat is away, we will.
Thanks. This is a one finger masking and two finger because they line up very well with the initial question. First of all, applauds the data effort. Sure, this is a huge corpus that you're going to capture and clean and everything. So appreciate that a lot. My question is,
Excuse me.
My question is, which public do you think this data is capturing? Because you're assuming that the n-gram data are representative of the text corpus that are coming out from the British and American press releases or like the press companies. Which countries or public do this really represent? Is it the Americans or the British or a mishmash of both? And I'm also thinking about who will read this type of books, right? And Cambridge University Press will show up in like all the other countries' bookshelves. So what is this? I guess what is this public really capturing? Similar and add on to the questions also about like translated versions. Are any of these English language publications translations from other, foreign presses or foreign languages, but translated into English? And what does that mean for this corpus?
Great. Yeah, thank you for that. So we have no idea whether they're translations or not, because we don't have any information about the books themselves. It's just so it'll affect whether it's about who's writing these books, what languages are they writing the books, how much did the books circulate, what genre are the books, and I unfortunately have to shrug every time we approach one of those questions, because we just don't know. Perhaps there are other data sets out there that show like that, maybe even like University of Chicago Library might have information about volumes and to which ones were translated from other languages that maybe we could cross-reference or something like that, but I'm not sure. As far as what the public is really capturing, I think it's a key question, and it is a major limitation on the corpus and how we interpret it, and it's open to interpretation. So, for example, I mentioned that it's not representative, but we also don't know necessarily. There's some evidence to suggest that it's biased towards like circulation, like public periodicals and things like that, relative to what all the print material that has been published in a given year, more professional texts, documentation and things like that, professional documentation. And so it probably skews more towards the elite literary type. That being said, I think what Google Books is really good for is kind of like I also mentioned that it doesn't capture circulation. So, one book might be massively popular in which the entire country read it. But another book never, sold a second copy, and it will still be treated as equal in our data set. But it does provide information about macro-linguistic trends. And there is, I think, just a central tendency in these texts, meaning that if you get enough of them, that it will get closer and closer to approximating print discourse. And print discourse, if there's enough of it, will get closer and closer to approximating public discourse. Now, maybe you don't buy those assumptions, but I think that they are at least fair enough assumptions to get the train out of the station, so to speak. But we should, again, just be careful in saying that this is not necessarily going to represent television or social media. But there are limitations with those platforms too, and scholars still get good use out of them. So that's kind of maybe the way that I buck the problem. It's like, well, we still have to find those useful. And so perhaps we can find this useful as well, even if it's not representative.
Barry, you've had a point of clarification that seems to blossom. Okay.
Leave me
No,
alone.
no. You're up still.
Well,
Go for it.
The questions you're getting and the answers you're giving keep changing my own question. Just wondered, as a kind of a experiment within your experiment, did you say take the British side of the story and run your various illustrations, test whatever we're going to call those representations you gave us, run them by France, Germany, and the United States from 1870 to 1920. So a half century of text on these three states to a country that's at the top of its game and then falling. Now, my guess would be, a kind of it would turn out with sort of the French are pretty negative at the start and much less negative at the end. The Germans are positive at the start and then much more negative at the end. And the Americans is kind of spring in various associations, word associations. But I'm blue sky here, but I'm just wondering, did you try any of those? In other words, the question was asked here, are you really reflecting what we kind of already know? But it would still be interesting to know or get a sense of whether representations in this corpus of work, which I think is the hint, is probably a middle to upper middle class intelligentsia kind of worldview. But that's not worth having. So I'm just wondering, did you try one or two of those just to see, does it map onto anything that maybe other people might have said in a different way, or conclusions they might have come to in a different way?
Sure. So one just point of clarification is that we don't have information on like positive or negative per se. So it's not necessarily that the public sees a country in positive ways or negative ways.
Descriptors and adjectives there that have certain flavor.
Sure.
Like your decline.
Sure.
Right.
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to be clear.
Good with machines. I mean.
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to be
Yeah,
clear that and so one plot that I produced recently, so it didn't make into the slides, is to look at a friend-enemy dimension. So with these traits, we can make a kind of dimension in space that maps on to a friend-enemy polarity, and we can load countries on to that dimension. It's basically a way of asking how associated is a country with a friend on one extreme and an enemy on another extreme. And so you could certainly pick certain countries and look at over time and see if they align with our qualitative historical knowledge. And we can also see on a macro scale whether they correlate with certain events. So, for example, if a country is at war with the United States, then it is more associated over time with an enemy. And that ends up being true, okay? So that would confirm, our intuitions. Other things, perhaps can make sense, but are a little bit less obvious. So if a country grows in power using like a Sensi metric for major military power, it becomes associated with an adversary. Okay. Now, maybe if you're a structural realist, that makes sense, but it's not would necessarily have to be the case if you take a different kind of scholarly paradigm. But that ends up being the fact of the matter that we find is that even if, controlling for other things, if a country grows in military power, it takes on a more adversarial reputation. Other things are surprising in that they don't matter. So trade, no effect. Okay. Kind of reminds me of Maria's work. You can either trade with the adversary, and it's still considered to be an adversary. All right. Whether the country's internal, basically, to put the associations aside and just looking at frequency, what we find is that if to the extent that this captures the American public writ large, which maybe it doesn't, but to the extent that it does, the American public does not care about the domestic dealings of other countries. Whether a country is going through a revolution, no increase in frequency. Whether it's going through a major political transition, no increase in frequency. Whether it has disasters, like natural disasters, no increase in frequency. What we care about is the relationship to us. Okay, so is it at war with us? Is it growing geopolitical power and thus, maybe threat to us? Does it speak the same language as us? Does it send immigrants to us? That those kinds of relational variables are what tracks attention. Again, these types of things you could say like are obvious in hindsight, but if you were to have to pre-register your hypotheses, I'm not exactly sure that it's obvious. It wasn't necessarily obvious to me that the American public doesn't care about the internal dealings of other countries, and only the thing that really is driving our attention is this more, narcissistic perspective.
The reason we all came here was so we could forget about those places. Maybe we did.
Although it is associated with a source of immigration, so take that for what it's worth.
I'm going to go to Nina in the back.
Sure. So I'm going to take advantage of the two-question rule and ask sort of a two-part question. That's about this issue of like how much leverage we can get out of this for IR theory and sort of specific theoretical projects. And so the first one is just thinking about like how we use what sort of the keyword relationship and proximity that's capturing something like images or frames in a confident way when we're applying it for something like reputation or status in IR theory. Often we think about not just general reputation, which might be some of the terms we popped up, but like reputation for what specifically. We talk about this in terms of countries being willing to follow through on threats or stand behind commitments. And so I wonder about like looking at words like trustworthy or reliable or unstable or firm or things like that that might capture this idea that we discuss about reputation. And then sort of as we think about like why use this body of data versus something like the New York Times, it seems like one of your sort of implicit arguments is that this is capturing the general public, maybe something we might consider a popular imagination. And I think in one of your answers you referred to having a subset of this data that's just fiction. And so I wonder about like running this analysis by comparing like fiction to your overall and seeing, which includes the nonfiction presumably, to get a feel for like how much crossover there is. My own hypothesis is that like I would expect fiction to track a lot less closely to like New York Times mentions, and that maybe these like professional publications and periodicals and encyclopedias are like tracking this current events such as world news and things like that in a more direct way. And that the fiction might actually get you more like a unique measure of popular imagination in terms of like how these countries are framed and discussed outside of elite circles.
Yeah, thanks for those ideas. And I agree that that looking just at the fiction would be a really interesting perspective on the public imagination per se. And we can then actually see to what extent the public imagination tracks real world events or newsworthiness or the types of things that would we think that the New York Times would capture. Again, I want to be really preliminary here because I haven't delved into it very deeply, but at least just on very, very broad strokes, it seems that there were less difference than I was expecting between fiction and the entire corpus, meaning that fiction really is an extension of the national conversation writ large. Again, that might change as we are a little bit more rigorous about the analyses, but at least again from preliminary findings, so it was surprisingly parallel, I suppose. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Well, this last point brought in a few two fingers, so I'll go to Phil first.
Yeah, so thanks. Can you describe the corpus, like when you talk about fiction, what percentage of the corpus, or how would you describe in a pie chart what the corpus looks like as far as the type of books?
Yeah, and unfortunately, I can't tell you that because I'm limited to what Google Books offers. And so Google Books offers only information about 5 grams, but they do offer different corpuses. So one corpus is all English books. Another corpus is just English books published in the United States. Another corpus is just fiction books that are published in English, and that's it. So what proportion those English books are to the main corpus, we can, perhaps try to estimate just using like the proportion of unigrams. So
give you a count, huh?
They do give you a count of yearly unigrams. So I can tell you which I don't have the numbers. I can probably just, divide, okay, the fiction has in 1990 has 1 million unigrams total, and the main corpus has 5 million. Okay, we can infer that it was 20%. And I haven't actually run those numbers, so I don't know to what the pie chart of at least fiction looks like. But also what I want to emphasize is that I can't even in principle tell you beyond fiction. So I can't tell you what proportion are textbooks or new periodicals or bestsellers or any additional category other than fiction. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Catherine, do you still have on the same point, or?
Yeah, so I was debating if it's a 2 or 1 finger. So sorry, it's sort of in between, but
The rules have gone away.
So kind of combining what Raymond's comments about the lag and leading, and then Ina's comments, it makes me think that underlying a lot of this discussion is just like norm cascades, and you can kind of get a very visual idea of like when norms are or aren't cascading. And I was wondering if we're thinking about comparing your corpus to New York Times, or I'm also thinking about political campaigns and speeches and things along those lines, and you could almost get another measure of like top down versus bottom up influence.
Mm-hmm.
So getting at the leader lag, like, is it more coming from this broader cultural piece? Does it depend on the topics? And so I thought that might be kind of an interesting way to compare elites versus not, or to assess to what extent the public you're measuring is actually closer to a public elites versus actual public.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. And one thing that just speaking on the theme of like what I found surprising, what I found surprising was actually the extent in which it differed from New York Times. We have this idea that that public understanding of world affairs is like completely shaped by elites, and yes, probably to a large extent it is. It's shaped by agenda setting in the news or by politicians, but it is indeterminate. That among mass discourse, at least, there's an error term, and whether it comes from romance novels that are set in France, or immigrants, the Dutch immigrants that are coming over, or Mexican immigrants, that's also another country that's overrepresented vis-a-vis the news, or food, or music, that there is just a certain public imagination that is autonomous. Again, another analysis that I didn't include in the presentation is that there are these authors that did a study where they surveyed Americans, a sample of Americans, and just asked them to list as many countries as they could recall from memory. And they compared that with mentions in the news. Okay. And they saw consistent with our findings, that there was a correlation broadly, but they were not the same. It was not a perfect correlation. And our data much more closely tracks what they call cultural memory. And so I think that this makes, in terms of IR theory, whenever this project has made me rethink whenever I see a study that does some kind of survey experiment or something and says like, if a country has enfranchisement of women or whatever, are we more likely to give it aid? And okay, that's definitely important knowledge for us to know. But it sorts of begs the question that Americans know that such and such real life country gives women enfranchisement or whatever. How do they know that? Okay, maybe politicians tell them that, but there is a certain wall or limitation that a politician can have in shaping the American imagination when it comes to foreign affairs. And that there's this other piece that we are not appreciating as much as we should.
I have Tyler, Kelly, and then myself and Raymond if we get time. Anyone else that I've missed? Okay, Tyler, go
Sorry
ahead.
for droning on.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so I have a question, I guess, about almost about the construction of the corpus. So thinking about it more from the perspective of like a data generating process, in terms of like what books are actually published and entering into the corpus in the first place. So we've seen obviously over since 1900 like a democratization of the publishing industry with like new groups or new members of new groups being able to publish in 2000 that could not in 1900. So do you think there's like a change in the frames we see that's just a function of the types of books that are entering into the corpus in the first place? How do you think the change in what books being published across time interacts with external changes in the world in terms of like discursive power of new actors? So the change in the corpus construction like track with new actors having power versus the opposite where there's like divergence between who's publishing and who is like a political elite or like in this electorate or has influence over the decision states made.
Absolutely. I think that's an important point. And you're right that the construction of the corpus in terms of, or the construction of the archive, you could apply it more generally, diversifies over time to a significant extent. That there are more people writing books. There are different kinds of people who are writing books. There are more books written by women. There are more books written by, racial and ethnic minorities and so on, and that they write about different things. And the composition of the corpus changes. It changes in other ways as well. So, for example, I mentioned that this is a lot of things we don't know about how the Google Books corpus is constructed. Some things we do know from Google and from other scholars. So one thing that we know is that there was like this huge influx of periodicals and technical work. Technical works meaning like, this is a textbook for how to put your computer together and that kind of thing, or code documentation and that kind of stuff. That there was a huge influx after a certain period of time. Okay. So all of which is to say, it's not just the diversity of authorship. It's like also just our print culture is changing in all kinds of different ways. Now the question then becomes, how should we interpret that fact vis-a-vis the findings that I just showed you? And I don't know. One interpretation could say that, okay, this corpus doesn't represent mass discourse because it was only published by a very tiny and certain, kind of author in the early part of the 20th century. Another way to interpret that is to say like, well, for better or for worse, that is kind of what public discourse about countries is that it was like led by this particular elite. So again, whether the corpus is representing mass culture or if it's actively shaping mass culture is like a tricky problem when thinking about these types of questions. And I wish I knew more. I wish I had more to tell you about how exactly the composition of the corpus has changed. But I'm relying on that central tendency that I was just describing, that on average, okay, if we see a significant shift over time, that is telling us something about our public imagination.
Kelly, read up.
So I had an original point of clarification, original question, then a question that came up.
And I'm so sorry, I was not looking to the back as well as I could have.
The question is, how confident with regard to hypothesis one are you that it would be the more the country is discussed, the stickier the reputation becomes, as opposed to a sticky reputation leads to significant presence in books, particularly in light of the lag. So you presumably have a way to get at the directionality or whether what you're measuring is a symptom of something rather than causal. So that's the question. The interpretive point of clarification was when you talked about, say, for instance, China appearing both, say, growth and decline, and you talked about status. Do you know that it's about status because it's because of the embeddedness, or could it be that there's a lot of discussion about China's simultaneous rise and growth alongside discussions of how this might be limited? Or could this be a discussion about economics and not a discussion about status? How do you know? And then the question that comes out of Barry's introduction is, did you try the same experiment on the Brits that you did on the subcorpus of the US? Because one might imagine, both for imperial historical reasons and decline in relative power reasons, that the Brits might be more interested in what's going on domestically inside other countries than the average American protected by the votes, etc.
Yeah, thank you for those. Those are really productive questions, and I'll try not to drone on for too long. So I'll take them kind of in reverse order. So the comparison with British English, I do have the comparison in terms of frequency, and so they largely track is the upshot. That the Brits tend to be just as narcissistic as the Americans, insofar as the kind of they don't. Trade doesn't make a difference in terms of frequency. Domestic civil war doesn't have a huge effect, but if they're at war with the UK, then it has a larger effect. Whether this is about, so I'm using the term status very, very loosely, and I apologize for that. But I'm using it. I'm almost using status and reputation interchangeably, and I know that they're not the same thing. But for the sake of your auditory diversity, I didn't want to use the word reputation over and over again. So I'm using the term status in a very general sense, and and that means that I'm not distinguishing.
Depending on how we're thinking about what that means.
Sure, yeah. Whether we're referring to like military growth versus economic growth, but what I will say is that it's interesting and perhaps informative to you that status type words were strongly associated, but economic type words were less so. So traits like rich and poor were not as distinctive to China as growth and decline. And again, this is like just very, very macro linguistic understandings that I think that the American, we're all scholars here, so we're very careful about our terms and our concepts, and we want to distinguish those things. And the normies out there are perhaps a little bit more loosey-goosey with their concepts, and perhaps don't. And I'm a Wittgensteinian insofar as I believe that the meaning of words are in its use. Okay, so China is associated with words like growth and decline on a macro scale, and whether or not people make strong differentiations between economic growth and military growth, I think I've read studies that say that show that they don't. I could be wrong, So let's just keep to kind of keep that in mind. So and then the whether the reputation is a symptom or a cause, I think it's fascinating. It really goes back to the lead and lag question, because it gets to a question I've been struggling with, which is, to what extent is this a window into public opinion, or is this to what extent are books a window into public opinion, or a source of attitude formation? Yeah, right. And to what extent is public discourse like a reflection of events, or does it drive events? Is a related question. And we can imagine, yeah, that, perhaps because it has a particular reputation as an enemy, that means that we need to study it and we need to write books on it and so on. I have been digging in more into the China example, and it very strongly tracks, Nixon's visit to China, which I think it's fair to interpret that as like an exogenous event from a Google Books perspective, at least partially. Insofar as that there were other things going on, and you saw a huge change in American discourse after that event and not before. But perhaps that this is topic specific. I don't know.
With that, I regret, because I have so many more questions myself, but we have lunch, to say that we come to the end of the session. Sorry, not the top of the hour. Join me in thanking our speaker.
Thank you.
And we'll figure out who the normies are and not let them in, right?
Yeah, thank you all for your comments.